Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Chol HaMoed. We'll be learning today Mirtz Hashem Daf Chaf Amud Aleph. We pick up today on the top of Chaf Amud Aleph in Siman Tov Kuf Mem Zayin, and we pick up near the end of Sif Yud. Now in reality I probably should have finished reading Sif Yud yesterday, the point at which I stopped. There's only another sentence of the Mechaber left. There's no Mishnah Berurah on it, and it's very simplistic. But so now, for the sake of continuity, let's just rewind and remember what we learned yesterday. We said yesterday in Sif Yud that you are allowed to oisin kol tzarchei hameis b'chol hamoed. You're allowed to do everything that's necessary to take care of a mace, to take care of a niftar on Chol HaMoed. And we said you're allowed to go and build an aron, you're allowed to build a coffin for the mace, and you're allowed to do that in the chutzner, in the courtyard where the mace is, so that people who see you erecting this coffin will understand that what you're doing is being done l'kavod ha-mace. We said that you don't have planks to fashion the coffin out of, then you could bring larger beams and you could cut planks out of the beams. However, the Mechaber said if you need to do that on Chol HaMoed, that has to be done b'tzina b'sayich habayis. It has to be done discreetly and inside the house. That should be not done out of doors in public. And we said that the reason for that is people are not necessarily going to understand why you're doing that. They're not going to realize that you're doing that l'kavod ha-mace. And that's why you have to do it b'tzina b'sayich habayis. Then the Mechaber said, "Ve'im haya adam mefursam," if the mace was a very well-known person, then oisam afilu b'shuk, then you could do something like preparing the planks, making the planks, even outside in public in the street. And the Mishnah Berurah said, because since the nifter was an adam mefursam, he was a well-known individual, everybody knows that he passed away, and when they see you doing the work, they'll understand that you're doing this to prepare for the burial of the mace. Now we go to the top line of the Shulchan Aruch and Chaf Amud Aleph, where the Mechaber says, "Uvemakom shehayehudim ma'at darim b'makom echad," in a locale where you only have, a small amount of Yidden living together in a small place, so you have a small Jewish neighborhood. Va'akol yoidim kisheyesh meis ba'ir, and therefore all of the Yiddish people that live in the neighborhood, they all know when somebody in the neighborhood dies. It's a very small neighborhood. Then hakol chashuv kimufursam, then everyone is considered a well-known individual. So if you have a small neighborhood, you have 50 families, and somebody who passes away, everybody in the neighborhood is aware of it. So that's the same thing as if it's in a large city and it was a very well-known person who passed away. Everybody is aware of the p'tira. And therefore you would be allowed to do malacha, like something like cutting the planks out of the beams. You would be allowed to do that even in public because everybody understands it's being done l'chvayid hameis. And now we go to Sif Yod Aleph. Says the Mechaber, Ein chayfrim kuchin b'chafira. If you learn the Gemaras in Baba Basra, you see that in the old days, and if you have gone to Eretz Yisrael, and you go to some of the kvarim of Tanoim and Amoraim, they used to bury mesim in kuchim. A kuch was a cave, essentially. So you have a cave that goes underground, and they would make niches in the walls of the cave where you could slide in a coffin. And that's the way they would do burials. They would do burials into the walls of these caves. And the Mechaber says, Ein chayfrim kuchin. You cannot dig out this kuch in the side wall of the cave, b'chafira, ukvarais bebinyan, nor can you build a kever. And my understanding of what this means, building a kever, let's say you have a cemetery that's located in a very wet location. What they would do is they would dig out a grave, and then they would line the walls of the kever with stone, and they would actually make a binyan. They could take stone and cement and actually build walls. So therefore, these are things that are a tirchi yisera. These jobs take a lot of work. Therefore, the Mechaber says, Ein chayfrim kuchin b'chafira. You're not allowed to dig out the kuchin. Kivaris bebinyan. Nor are you allowed to build a kever b'chol hamoed on Chol HaMoed liyos muchanim lemeis sheyamus. You're not digging this kever because you have a mace that needs to be buried. You are a worker you have a cemetery. And when it comes to kuchim, or these kfarim that have to be built, what they would do is they would dig out 10 kuchim, they would line 10 graves, so that they have graves ready. When a mace dies, there's a grave that's ready. If you're just digging a kever, so you don't have to do that in advance. Somebody dies, you need a kever, you get the grave diggers, you dig the kever. But something like a kuch, or something like a kever that has to be built, this is something that would be prepared in advance. Therefore, the Mechaber says, you're not allowed to go dig these kuchim or build these kfarim in advance. You can't do that on Chol HaMoed. Liyos muchanim lemeis sheyamus, so that they should be prepared should they be necessary because somebody died. That's not something that you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. Why should you be allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed? The digging of the kuch is a terchi yisera. It takes a lot of work. Some say it's also a maise uman. Lining the grave is a terchi yisera and is a maise uman. So what heter do you have to do this on Chol HaMoed? It's not sarchei hamoed. You don't need it for the moed. There's no mace now. Even if you're going to call it sarchei rabim, it's something that you need for the rabim. The tzibur needs graves to be ready, but it's sarchei rabim la'achar hamoed. Sarchei rabim la'achar hamoed. The only thing that's mutter is maise hedyet, not maise uman. So therefore, this is not mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and chav daled. Liyos muchanim shayadarkan lachbar kuchen liyos mezumanim litzarich meisim sheyamusu. It was the derech that they would prepare these kuchen, they would dig them out in advance so that they should be ready should they be needed. The terchi yisera, and this is a terchi yisera. Aval litzarich hamoyed, but if this would be litzarich hamoyed, likbar by mace b'sayich hamoyed, if you actually have a mace on Chol HaMoed, then chayfren afilu b'tchila b'sayich hamoyed, then you certainly would be allowed to dig out the kuch or build the kever, because like we said yesterday in Sif Yud, oisin kol tzarchei mace b'Chol HaMoed, whatever you need to do for a mace, you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. The problem over here is you're not doing it for a mace on Chol HaMoed, you're doing it la'achar hamoed. Continues the Mechaber. So the Mechaber said you're not allowed to do this on Chol HaMoed. However, 3 lines down says the Mechaber, aval mechanchin oisam. However, you can improve an existing kuch or an existing built kever. What does that mean? Says the Mechaber. Shem haya aroich. If it was too long, mikatzroi, you could fill it in and make it shorter. Or you could dig it out to make it a little bit longer. Or you could dig it out to make it a little bit wider. That you are allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. Why are you allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed, even though it's not tzarech hamoed? There's no mace in front of you right now. So I think the reason is because it's tzarchei rabim. And if it's tzarchei rabim, you're allowed to do a maise hedyet. And to just dig it out to make it a little wider, make it a little longer, fill it in, make it a little shorter, that's already not as much of a tircha, and that's a maise hedyet. So a maise hedyet, l'tzarchei rabim, you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. Now we go to Sif Yud Beis. The final Sif in this Siman. Says the Mechaber, Ein litloish asavim va'afar b'Chol HaMoed b'beis hakvaros. You're not allowed to uproot grass, vegetation, or dirt on Chol HaMoed in the Beis HaKvaros. K'moishe nayagim lasos b'chol, as is the minig to do during the week. Exactly what does this mean? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah says in Ois Katan Chavhei, Ein litlosh. Be'Eli Rabba Kasav, the Eli Rabba writes, Tezem Mairi, this is referring to Shelikton Litzayrich Beis HaKvaros. We're talking over here where somehow, as part of the work of preparing or maintaining the surface of the Beis HaKvaros, you have to uproot some grass, you have to uproot vegetation, or you have to smooth out an area, so you have to take out some dirt. These are all things that you don't do on Chol HaMoed. If that's what it means, then I'm not 100% sure why this is usher. Why are you doing it? If it's something that's, well, I guess maybe even if you're doing it for the maintenance of the Beis HaKvaros, that's maybe not called Sarchei Rabim. The Rabim doesn't necessarily need the Beis HaKvaros to be maintained. So let's say you're pulling out weeds in the Beis HaKvaros. You're going to call that Tzarchei Rabbim. How much does the Rabbim really need that? I don't know if the Rabbim needs that or the owners of the Beis HaChaim need that. I'm not sure who really needs that. Because certainly just pulling out grass is only a Maaseh Hedyot. So if it would be called the Tzarchei Rabbim, then l'chayre it should be mutter on Chol HaMoed. But again, I'm saying that maybe this is not really called Tzarchei Rabbim. You want to say that to dig kuchen and to build kvaros is a Tzarchei Rabbim? Yes, the Rabbim needs graves to be available when they need graves. So that's Tzarchei Rabbim. But is weeding the Beis HaChaim, pulling out grass, leveling a bumpy area in the Beis HaChaim, is that really something that's going to rise to the level of Tzarchei Rabbim, that it should be mutter on Chol HaMoed, even if it's a Maaseh Hedyot? Don't do it on Chol HaMoed. So, in the beginning at least, in the Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah is bringing from the Eliyah Rabbah that this is what the Mechaber is referring to. When the Mechaber says you can't uproot vegetation or take out uproot earth from the surface of the Beis HaKvaros on Chol HaMoed, it's talking about when you're doing this for the purposes of maintaining the Beis HaKvaros. Aval, however, continues the Mishnah Berurah, Masha Tolshin Achar Kvuras HaMeis Zecher Latchia. However, the minig that there is to uproot some grass, maybe you've seen this in the Beis HaChaim. People after a kfura, they uproot some grass and they throw it over their shoulder. I'm not sure where the throwing over their shoulder goes, but what the point of that is. But there is a minig to uproot some grass. Some people do it whenever they go to the Beis HaChaim. Some people only do it by a kfura. And this is done, says the Chavetz Chaim, zecher latchia. That's a zecher for Tchias HaMesim. That, says the Chavetz Chaim, that is shari. That's mutter. Now, what's the source of this minig? The source of this minig is actually, it comes from a, maybe a Psikta Rabasi. It's based on a pasuk in Tehillim. The pasuk in Tehillim says, Vayatzitzu me'ir ke'esev ha'aretz. This is Kapitel Ayin Beis in Tehillim, pasuk Tez Zayin. And the psukim over there in Kapitel Ayin Beis are talking about Yemois HaMashiach. They're talking about the time when Mashiach will come. He should come, b'meher v'yameinu. We certainly need him to come. So when Mashiach will come, the pasuk says, "Vayatzitzu me'ir." The Yidden will blossom forth from the city, ke'esev ha'aretz, like the grasses of the earth. And that's why we have a minig. We uproot the grass, and we say that there's going to be Tchias HaMesim, Vayatzitzu me'ir. The Klal Yisrael, the Yidden will blossom. What is that referring to? They're going to blossom forth. All those who have already passed on are going to blossom forth, ke'esav ha'aretz, like the grasses of the earth. So to fulfill that minig, you're allowed to uproot grass, according to this opinion in the Mishnah Berurah on Chol HaMoed. And the Mefarshim seem to say that that's a shtikl tzarchei mitzvah. That's the remez to Tchias HaMesim. That's something that's mutter on Chol HaMoed. However, the Mishnah Berurah says, "Ubesefer Maimer Mordechai," in the Sefer Maimer Mordechai, mefakfek al zeh, he disagrees with this. The Kosev, and he writes, "The Pashtius HaShulchan Aruch Einoi Kain." A simple reading of the words on the Mechaber, it doesn't sound like when the Mechaber says, "Ein litloish asavim va'afar b'chol hamoed b'beis hakvaros." It doesn't sound that means maintaining the Beis HaKvaros. Why? Because he says, "K'moishe noyagim lasois b'chol." It sounds like the Shulchan Aruch is saying we don't uproot grass or uproot earth from the Beis HaKvaros like we have a minig to do when we're there during the week. That sounds like he's talking about the minig that we do zecher l'tchias hamesim. So it sounds like the Mechaber is saying we don't do that minig on Chol HaMoed. Doesn't sound like he's talking about weeding. That's not a minig or maintaining the grounds of the Beis HaKvaros. He wouldn't write k'moishe noyagim lasos b'chol. So therefore, the Mishnah Berurah says the Maimer Mordechai is mefakvik on this. The Kosav the Pashtius HaShulchan Aruch Einoi Kain v'chein minig, and indeed he says this is the minig shaloi litloish b'chol hamoed, that we do not uproot grass on Chol HaMoed to be mekayim the minig. Now we go to the Ramah to close out this Siman. Says the Ramah, Din tziduk hadin b'moed. Do we say tziduk hadin? Tziduk hadin is by the kvura, we make a bracha to be matzdik the din. We justify the Rebbeinu Shalom's din. We say that the Rebbeinu Shalom is a dayan emes, and the Rebbeinu Shalom's din is a din amiti. So din tziduk hadin b'moed, as far as the halacha, whether or not you say tziduk hadin on Chol HaMoed, ayin b'Yeridei Siman Tov Aleph Sif Vav. Says the Mishnah Berurah Chavav din tziduk hadin b'moed. Says the Chavetz Chaim, kishe'ein oimrim tziduk hadin, whenever we do not say tziduk hadin, ein oimrim gamkein shivcha shel meis. We also don't say praises of the departed one. Tahani nami margil hahesped. The reason why we don't say tziduk hadin is because tziduk hadin will bring one to be maspid the mace. And we're not allowed to be maspid the mace on Chol HaMoed because that runs contrary to Simchas HaMoed. It runs contrary to the Samachta B'Chagecha. So if we don't say tziduk hadin, we also don't speak about the praises of the mace. V'im kain, and if so, says the Chavetz Chaim, also lidrosh alav, you're not allowed to be doiresh. Now, being doiresh and being maspid are apparently two different things. Being maspid is to eulogize the mace and wail and cry over the loss of the mace. Lidrosh alav is different. Lidrosh alav is to darshan. I guess lidrosh alav would be maybe to say a shmuz based on what you know about the mace. So if the mace had tremendous kavod HaTorah, you want to give a shmuz about kavod HaTorah. If the mace was somebody who sat and learned Torah, you want to give a shmuz about the chashivas of learning Torah, and you want to base it on him, maybe that's lidrosh alav. V'im kain also lidrosh alav ela l'chacham b'fanav, that would only be mutter if you're doing this in regards to a Talmid Chacham when the mace is mutar l'fanav. V'chol shkein b'Yom Tov da'aser. Ubizvanenu ein din Talmid Chacham v'chanal b'Mishnah Berurah Siv Katan Yud Beis. Like we said yesterday, we don't really have somebody that we would call a Talmid Chacham in the context of this halacha. Hamasan tanis chaloim b'Chol HaMoed. If somebody fasts a tanis chaloim on Chol HaMoed, tzarich l'meisav achar HaMoed tanis l'ta'anisai. He has to fast again after Yom Tov to get a kapara for the fast that he did on Chol HaMoed. He had to fast on Chol HaMoed because he had to fast the tanis chaloim. However, he has to do another fast after Yom Tov to gain kapara for the fact that he fasted on Chol HaMoed. V'toiv sheyeh achar Isru Chag, and says the Chavetz Chaim, it would be best that second fast should take place not on Isru Chag, not the day right after Yom Tov, because Isru Chag is a little bit of a Yom Tov. Rather, it should take place after Isru Chag. Okay, now we go to Siman Tov Kuf Mem Ches. Dinei Avelus b'Chol HaMoed, the halachas that govern mourning Avelus on Chol HaMoed, Ubai Chaf Seifim, and here we have 20 Seifim. Just looking. Wow, I didn't even realize. Rabbi Sai, we are now entering the last Siman in Hilchos Chol HaMoed. Wowee. Unbelievable. See how time flies, and when you do a page a day, how fast it goes. What a beautiful limud this has been, Hilchos Chol HaMoed. This is the last Siman in Hilchos Chol HaMoed, and then we're going, and it's a little bit maybe apropos that we're busy talking about Hilchos Avelus, because when we finish Hilchos Chol HaMoed, we're going to go straight into Hilchos Tisha B'Av. So, Siman Tov Kuf Mem Ches. Dini Avelus b'Chol HaMoed, u'boi Chaf Seifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. HaKover es meisoi b'soich haregel. If somebody loses one of the close relatives that he has to be misabel on, so he said those are the Zayin Kroivim, which are father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, spouse. HaKover es meisoi b'soich haregel. Somebody buries a mace on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah right away, Nois Katan Aleph b'soich haregel, bein b'Yom Tov, bein b'Chol HaMoed. When we say b'soich haregel, we're referring to a kvura, a loss at a kvura that takes place either on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed. Lo yichal alav avelus baregel. The avelus, the Shivah, does not begin on Yom Tov. This loss took place on Yom Tov. The Shivah and the period of avelus is not going to begin on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed. Ela la'achar haregel maschil limnois Shivah. Rather, the first day of Shivah is going to start after Yom Tov, and we'll see specifically when. V'noyeg behem avelus, and you will keep Avelos of Shivah after Yom Tov, not on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut and base. Loi chol. The Mechaber said if somebody experiences a loss of this type on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed, the Mechaber said Loi chol alav Avelos beregel. The Avelos does not begin. The mourning period does not begin on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed. Explains the Chavetz Chaim. The asi mitzvahs asay de simchas haregel shehu asay de rabim. The mitzvahs asay v'samachta b'chagecha. The mitzvahs asay to be misameach on the Yom Tov is not just a regular mitzvahs asay. It's a mitzvahs asay de rabim. It's a mitzvahs asay that applies to the whole tzibur, and therefore it has an edge over a mitzvahs asay de yachid. Like the Chavetz Chaim says, the asi mitzvahs asay de simchas haregel shehu asay de rabim. The mitzvahs asay of simchas hamoed, which is an asay de rabim, comes the dachi avelus, and it is doiche the halachas of avelus. It pushes aside the halachas of avelus to hu rak mitzvah de yachid, because the mitzvah of avelus is only a mitzvah de yachid. It only applies to the individual avelim. It doesn't apply to the entire tzibur at one time. Ois Katan Gimel, Baregel, the Avelus does not begin on Yom Tov. However, the Chavetz Chaim says, there is one minig that you do keep. What is that? We call Makam, nevertheless, says the Chavetz Chaim, Haner Shirigilim Lahadlik Kol Shivah. The Ner Shivah, the Ner, like the yahrtzeit licht, but the one that we light in a Shivah house that burns for all 7 days, that become makam aner shirigilin lahadlik kol shiva yadlik tekef. That should be lit right away. On Chol HaMoed, it should be lit right away. Ve'ein zeh tolui, and I mean yadlik tekef, we're going back even if the loss took place on Yom Tov. So even on Yom Tov, not only on Chol HaMoed, even on Yom Tov, this licht that burns for the whole shiva, that should be lit immediately, right away. Ve'ein zeh tolui b'masha haregel mevatal ha'avelus, oy she'ein chal ad achar haregel. And this is not affected by the fact that the period of avelus does not begin until after Yom Tov. So somebody passed away on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed, we just said that avelus doesn't start. Shiva doesn't start until after Yom Tov. Yet the ner of Shiva you have to light now, right away. Rak shelo yadlik b'makam she'oichle misham, but you should not light this in a place, let's say in the dining room, where you're going to see it when you eat. V'chol shekein b'hacheder shemeis sham, nor should you light it in the room where the mace is located. And later poskim say you should not light it, let's say in the living room, where you're going to spend a lot of time on Yom Tov. Don't light it in any of those places. Light it in an out-of-the-way place. Why? Shema mitoch kach yavoi lahaspidoi. Because if you're going to light the ner shel shiva somewhere where you're going to see it constantly, you might come to be maspid the mace on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed, and that's usher. Rather, what should you do, says the Chavetz Chaim? Ella, yadlik b'makom she'ein oichlin sham, light it somewhere where you don't eat, so you're not going to see it. Achein, however, kevon she'ein nena la'or zeh klal, since it comes out that you're not going to get any benefit out of this ner, you're not going to use this ner to supply light, you're using this ner, you're lighting this ner in an out-of-the-way place. And we don't want you to see this ner all the time, because we're afraid it's going to arouse in you the desire to be maspid the mace. So what hana are you getting out of this light? You're not getting any hana out of this light. And if you're not getting hana out of the light, then really the halacha that we learned earlier in Siman Tov Kuf Yud Daled in Hilchos Yom Tov, Sif Hey, should apply to this. This is what we would call a ner shel batala. This is a ner. We know that you're allowed to light it. You're allowed to light a ner on Yom Tov, right? If you need a candle, you're allowed to light one. You can't make a new fire, but if you have a burning flame and you want to light another candle from a pre-existing flame on Yom Tov, you're allowed to do that. But only if there's a tzorech, a ner shel batala, a ner that you're not going to get any benefit out of and you're not going to use it at all, that we said you're not allowed to light on Yom Tov. And this ner that we're lighting now, it turns out is like a ner shel batala, because you're not going to derive any benefit from it. Therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, Achein, kevan she'ein nena la'or zeh klal, since you're not deriving any benefit out of this ner of Shiva at all, Lo yadlik ba'atzmai b'Yom Tov. You should not light it on your own on Yom Tov. Ela al yedei akum. Rather, you should ask a non-Jew to light it for you. And he brings this down from the Pri Megadim and from Rabbi Kiva Eger. Now, a couple of points that I want to address over here. First of all, why is this true? Why is it that even though the Shivah is postponed until after Yom Tov, you light this licht right away after the P'tira, and you light it even on Yom Tov, even on Chol HaMoed, and you have it burning the whole Yom Tov, even though you're not starting Shivah until after Yom Tov? And I believe the reason for this is that you have to understand what this ner is for. This ner is not based on minhagei avelus. This ner has nothing to do with avelus. This ner, it's brought down, is a kairas ruach for the neshama. Somehow the neshama derives some level of benefit out of this ner. And therefore, since you're doing it le'ilui nishmasai, you're doing it for the purposes of the mace. It has nothing to do with avelus. So the lighting of the ner does not run contrary to Simchas Yom Tov, as long as you put it in an out-of-the-way place where it's not going to make you go into mourning and make you go be maspid the mace. So light it in an out-of-the-way place for the purposes of the mace. And for the purposes of the mace, whatever kairas ruach, whatever benefit, whatever hana the mace gets out of this flame, the mace gets that hana during the first 7 days after the p'tira. He doesn't get it later. So the mace needs it now. So you light it l'tzarech hameis. Now, the Mishnah Berurah said that really there's no heter for you to light this because it's a ner shel batala. And a ner shel batala, we learned in Siman Tov Kuf Yud Daled, you're not allowed to light. Now, if you look over here in the Sharetzion, Ois Cotton Gimel, the Sharetzion brings us to an interesting halacha. He says, "Va'ayin b'simin Tov Kuf Yud Daled Sifhei b'bir halacha." He sends us back to Hilchos Yom Tov to Tov Kuf Yud Daled Sifhei to the bir halacha. Mashe kasavnu sham oidos yahrtzeit. What I wrote over there about a yahrtzeit licht, b'shem ksav sefer, in the name of the ksav sefer, the l'chayra hu hadin lakan, and l'chayra the same halacha would apply over here. Now, I'm a little surprised. I looked back in Siman Tov Kuf Yud Daled, and I don't think I covered this when we learned Siman Tov Kuf Yud Daled, and I definitely should have. I'm pretty convinced that I didn't, because usually when I say over a bir halacha, I usually underline it in my Mishnah Berurah, and this one was not underlined. Now, before I read to you the actual words of the bir halacha, I'll just tell you a funny story. Many years ago, when I was still a bacher, and I was living in Borough Park, and my family davened in the Svardish Shul on 14th Avenue. My father, Al Rishon, was the Gabbai in the Svardish Shul for over 30 years. I used to give a shiur on Kitzur Shulchan Aruch between Kriyas HaTorah and Musaf. I used to say two or three seifim in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and I would prepare Friday night. Now, I was young, and I was a bacher, and I guess I was a little, what word would you use? Cocky. I was a little, Greuser Knacker syndrome, like my Shver would say. And one Friday night, I was home from yeshiva, and I was tired, and I wanted to go to sleep, and I knew I had to prepare the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, but I said to myself, all right, look, it's only Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, how difficult could it be? I was in the middle of learning Hilchos Yom Tov with the tzibur. So I said, all right, I'll give a quick look at it, tomorrow morning. So I went to sleep. In the morning, I woke up a little bit later than I expected to, and I didn't have time to look at the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch before davening. So by davening, I opened up a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in the beginning of laning, and I was reviewing the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch ben Gavra leGavra. Between aliyas, I'm preparing the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And I come to the halacha in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, where the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says that you are not allowed to light a yahrtzeit licht on Yom Tov, which is something that so many people do. They light a yahrtzeit licht. Yizkar is the second day Yom Tov, so the second day Yom Tov, they light a yahrtzeit licht. So they're lighting a yahrtzeit licht on Yom Tov. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch writes, you're not allowed to light a yahrtzeit licht on Yom Tov. And I knew I'm going to get up in the Svardish Shul in Borough Park circa 1985. So I'm in a shul full of Ungarische Yidden, Heimische Yidden, mostly from Chassidish stock. And I'm going to say that you're not, and these are survivors also, I'm going to say that you're not allowed to light a yahrtzeit licht on Yom Tov. I'm going to have a rebellion on my hands. I hope they don't stone me. But what am I going to do? That's where I'm up to in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. So I got up by the bima and I said, Rabbi Say, I'm going to teach you the halacha that the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says. Realize that it's a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. I don't know if we necessarily paskin this way, but I'm going to read what the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says, and I'll discuss it with Rabbi Singer, now Zechet Tzadik Levracha, who was then the Rav of the Svardish Shul. I'll discuss it with him after davening, and I'll get you his psak, and he'll say what the halacha is. So I told him the halacha that we don't light a yahrtzeit licht on Yom Tov, and indeed they were ready to stone me. After Yom Tov, they were all coming at me. So I go upstairs to Rabbi Singer, and I asked Rabbi Singer Zatzal about it. Rabbi Singer started laughing. He told me, you're being hoisted on your own petard. I said, what do you mean? He said, it's your Zayda who made the problem. I said, what do you mean? So he points me to a Shalos Chuvas Imrei Eish. It was come from the Maramash, who I'm a descendant of the Maramash, and who wrote a Shaila to the Chassam Sofer, and told the Chassam Sofer that it doesn't seem that there's any heter at all to light a yahrtzeit licht on Yom Tov. L'chayr, it's a ner shel batala. It's not something that you derive any benefit from. So what heter do you have to light it on Yom Tov? And it seems that the Chassam Sofer indeed agreed with him. But the Chassam Sofer, I think, Rabbi Singer told me, was the Chassam Sofer said that he doesn't know, it might be Gzeira She'yev She'rev Tzibur Lamed Boi. He doesn't know if the Tzibur would be ready to accept the psak and not to light it. And there are various possible heterim. So I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I think the Chassam Sofer didn't want to make an issue out of it. But here we have, I'm going now to Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey, Daf Kuf Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis, Siman Tov Kuf Yud Dalet Sif Hey, in the Bir Halacha, where the Chavetz Chaim indeed addresses this shaila. And the Chavetz Chaim over here writes, V'da oid, you should know, the ner shel yahrtzeit, when it comes to a yahrtzeit licht, im loy hidlikoi be'erev Yom Tov, if you did not light the yahrtzeit licht on erev Yom Tov. Rabbi said, the Chavetz Chaim is clearly telling you over here that you should light a yahrtzeit licht on erev Yom Tov. Don't light the yahrtzeit licht the night of the second day of Yom Tov. Light the yahrtzeit licht on erev Yom Tov. And indeed, I have in my house, when I need a yahrtzeit licht for Yizkar, I get bigger yahrtzeit licht that can burn for 2 days. I don't get one that's a 1-day candle. I get a 2-day candle. So I could light the yahrtzeit licht on erev Yom Tov. Yadli kenu al kol panim b'cheder she'oichlin boi, the moisef oira b'cheder. The Chavetz Chaim says if you neglected to light it on erev Yom Tov, he says, so at least light it in the dining room, where you're going to derive some benefit. At least maybe at night, even though we have electric lights, how much benefit do you really get? I don't know. But the Chavetz Chaim said, light it somewhere where you'll get benefit from it. Or, the Yoser Toiv, the Chavetz Chaim says it would be even better, Sheyadli Kenu Bebeis HaKnesses. You should light it in shul. The Yetzei Mechshash Ner Shal Batola. Because here in Siman Tov Kuf Yodalid, it's brought down the halacha. It says, Avol Shal Beis HaKnesses Loi Chashiv Shel Batola. You're allowed to light neris, even extra neris that you don't need. You're allowed to light in shul, because that's considered a covet for the Beis HaKnesses. So if you didn't light the yahrtzeit licht on erev Yom Tov, and you're not going to get any benefit from it in the house, so light it in shul. If you light it in shul, you take care of this problem of ner shel batola. Or b'shas atchak, if it's a shas atchak, you didn't light it on erev Yom Tov, somehow you can't light it in shul. Efsher diyesh lahater b'chol gavni, maybe you could be mater it, to have a ke'ein ner shel mitzvah, because maybe you could a shtickle call it a ner shel mitzvah l'chvoid avoisav. Since you're lighting this ner as a covet for your forefathers, you're doing it l'chvoid your father, l'chvoid your grandfather, so then maybe you could call it a shtickle a ner shel mitzvah, kein misbar b'tshuvas ksav sofer. So the ksav sofer, of whom I'm also I shouldn't say I'm a descendant, I'm not a descendant of the ksav sofer. The ksav sofer's second wife was a Weiss. But I'm not a descendant of that marriage. I'm not a descendant of the Ksav Sofer. His second wife was a Weiss. But the Ksav Sofer writes in a tshuva that in a Shasat Chak, you could be mater lighting the yahrtzeit licht on Yom Tov. It's a shtickle a ner shel mitzvah, because you're lighting it l'chvayt avoisav. But me'ikar adin, you really should not light a yahrtzeit licht on Yom Tov. You should light the yahrtzeit licht preferably on erev Yom Tov, or light it in the Beis HaKnesses. Okay. Now we continue in the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch told us over here the first halacha. He said if somebody never passes away on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed, so Shivah does not begin until after Yom Tov. Now we continue in the Mechaber right by the Ois Cut and Daled for the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mechaber, so we have a very interesting dichotomy over here. Somebody passes away on Yom Tov, either on Yom Tov proper or on Chol HaMoed. Shivah does not begin until after Yom Tov. But the first day of Shivah after Yom Tov is not going to be the first day of Shloshim. Shloshim starts right away when after the Kvura, even if the Kvura was on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed, that's when Shloshim, the count of Shloshim begins. So Shivah is actually going to take place in middle of Shloshim. Shloshim starts in middle of Yom Tov. V'noyeg b'shar Shloshim k'chol gzera Shloshim, and then after Yom Tov, Shloshim will continue, and you'll keep all the dinim of Shloshim. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cut and Dalet, U'moyne Shloshim miyayim ha'kvura. The count of the Shloshim starts from the day of the Kvura. So if the Kvura was on Chol HaMoed, that day is going to be the first day of Shloshim, even though you didn't yet start Shivah. Ushmini atzeres, and I'll explain this halacha, let me just read the words. Ushmini atzeres, let's say somebody died on the first day of Chol HaMoed of Sukkot, and the Kvura was on the first day of Chol HaMoed Sukkot. The Mechaber just said, for the purposes of Shloshim, you're going to start counting now. From Chol HaMoed Sukkos, you're going to start counting Shloshim. In that count is going to come Shmini Atzeres. Now, here's an interesting question, which the Mishnah Berurah is addressing over here. How many days of Shloshim is Shmini Atzeres going to be worth? What does that mean? Well, there's an interesting halacha. The halacha is like this. Right now, we're discussing the halacha of somebody who dies on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed. If somebody dies on Yom Tov or on Chol HaMoed, Shivah doesn't begin until after Yom Tov. But let's say somebody dies Erev Yom Tov. If somebody dies Erev Yom Tov and the Kvura was Erev Yom Tov, and you had time to sit Shivah for an hour on Erev Yom Tov, then Shivah started on Erev Yom Tov and Shivah ends on Erev Yom Tov. Shivah doesn't continue on Yom Tov because there can't be a Shivah on Yom Tov. That's contrary to Simchas HaMoed. And Shivah does not pick up again after Yom Tov. The Yom Tov breaks the Shivah. Shivah is over. Not only does Yom Tov break the Shivah, but there's another interesting halacha that applies to Shloshim. Erev Yom Tov was the first day of Shivah. And since you sat Shivah for an hour on Erev Yom Tov, that is going to stand for 7 days of Shloshim. So Erev Yom Tov, when you sat Shivah for an hour, that is going to give you 7 days of Shloshim. Why? Because that hour is considered your whole Shivah. Yom Tov is breaking your Shivah. There is no more Shivah. So that hour counts for 7 days. Then Yom Tov itself counts for 8 days. So that gives you 15 days. Now, the question is, how about Shmini Atzeres? Does Shmini Atzeres count for 7 days, or does Shmini Atzeres count for 1 day? So we're going to speak about that later on. But in the context of our halacha over here, the Mechaber is discussing a case where somebody didn't die before Yom Tov. Somebody died on Yom Tov. Now, if somebody died on Yom Tov, Shivah never started. So then Yom Tov is not breaking Shivah. Shivah is going to start after Yom Tov. But the Mechaber told us, even though Shivah starts after Yom Tov, Shloshim starts on Yom Tov. So again, in the case that we had, let's say somebody died on Hoshana Rabbah. Somebody died on Hoshana Rabbah. Okay, Shivah is going to start after Yom Tov is over. Shloshim starts, the Kvura was on Hoshana Rabbah, so Hoshana Rabbah is the first day of Shloshim. Now, what happens with Shmini Atzeres? Is Shmini Atzeres the second day of Shloshim, and Simchas Torah is the third day of Shloshim? Or do we apply the halacha that sometimes Yom Tov counts for 7 days? Should we say now that Shmini Atzeres counts for 7 days? And the answer is no. The answer is that in this case, Shmini Atzeres is 1 day. So Shana Rabbah is the first day of Shloshim, Shmini Atzeres is the second day of Shloshim, Simchas Torah is the third day of Shloshim. Now, when does Shmini Atzeres count for 7 days? That we're going to see later on in this Siman. We're going to see that there's a case where Shmini Atzeres actually counts for 7 days. I'll give you a heads up. What case is that? That's the case where somebody dies before Sukkot and starts his Shivah before Sukkot. In that case, the little bit of Shivah that he counts before Sukkot counts for 7 days. Then Yom Tov counts for 7 days. And then Shmini Atzeres also counts for 7 days. Even though Shmini Atzeres is only 1 day, it counts for 7. Because Shmini Atzeres is a Yom Tov b'fnei atzmai, and it's compared to all the other Yom Tovim. Just like Pesach counts for 7 days, and Sukkot counts for 7 days, and Shavuos counts for 7 days, Shmini Atzeres also counts for 7 days. But in the context of our halacha here, Ois Katan Daled, the Mishnah Berurah says, U'moyne shloisha miyom hakvura, u'shmini Atzeres eina nechshav bazer rak yom echad. But Shmini Atzeres only counts for 1 day. Okay. Ois Katan Hey, Kechol Gzera Shloishim. The Mechaber said, Shloishim begins in the middle of Yom Tov, and then after Yom Tov, Shloishim is going to continue, of course, after Yom Tov, to count till the end of 30 days, and you keep all the halachas of Shloishim, says the Mishnah Berurah, Dahainu begiluach v'tispairis arechitza b'chamin v'idvarm u'vuvar b'yardeil b'chaz avelus. All of the halachas of avelus that pertain to Shloishim will pertain to Shloishim in the normal fashion. Some Mefarshim question very much. They wonder why this was even said over here. What was the point of this halacha? Why did the Mechaber have to say it? There's no reason to think that the halachas of Shloishim shouldn't apply the way they always do. Okay, now we go to Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber. Where we have 2 days of Yom Tov, right? Let's say us, we have Yom Tov Sheni Shal Galias, where we have 2 days of Yom Tov, Mayna Hashiva mi Yom Tov Sheni Ha'achrein. Very interesting halacha. So like we said, somebody died Nebuch Le'aleinu on Hoshana Rabbah. Shivah starts after Yom Tov. Shivah can't start on Yom Tov. But when exactly does the Shivah start? Says the Mechaber over here, it starts on Simchas Torah, Yom Tov Sheni Shal Galias, B'mekayim she'osid Shnei Yomim Tovim, where you have Yom Tov Sheni Shal Galias, Mayna Hashiva mi Yom Tov Sheni Ha'achron. The first day of Shivah is Yom Tov Sheni, is the last day of Yom Tov. Afal pi she'ein noyeg by Avelus, even though you're not going to be able to keep them in the Dinei Avelus, because that would be contrary to Simchas Yom Tov. So you're not going to keep the halachas of Avelus, but it's going to count as the first day of Shivah. Why? Hayul umidivreim hu, since this Simchas Torah Yom Tov Sheni is only a derabanan, it counts for the count of Shivah. And then after that, you'll count only another 6 days. Now, I should be careful to point out, this only applies to Yom Tov Sheni Shal Galias of the 2nd days of Yom Tov. This can't apply to Yom Tov Sheni Shal Galias of the 1st days. This wouldn't apply to the 2nd day Yom Tov of the 1st days of Pesach. So that if somebody died on the 1st day of Yom Tov, now the 2nd day of Yom Tov is going to be the 1st day of Shivah. No, it's Yom Tov. Yom Tov can't start until after Yom Tov, until after the entire Yom Tov. The Chiddush over here is that Yom Tov Sheni Shal Galias of the 2nd days of Yom Tov. So that Shmini, Achron Shal Pesach, or Simchas Torah, those count as the 1st day of Shivah for after Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Yom Tov Sheni Achron, Ois Katan Vav, you start counting Shivah from Yom Tov Sheni Shal Galias of the 2nd days, La'afuke Yom Tov Sheni Harishain, like I just told you, like Gara me Chol HaMoed, that's no less than Chol HaMoed, the Ein Olam in a Minyan. Ois Katan Zayin, the last days, so Achron Shal Pesach, or Simchas Torah, that counts as the 1st day of Shivah after Yom Tov. Afal pi she'ein noyeg, even though you can't keep any of the halachas of Avelos on that day. Clearly in this sif, we're talking about the case where somebody died during Yom Tov. If somebody died on Achron Shel Pesach, or on Simchas HaTorah, Mavur Das HaMechaber L'Kamei Denoig by Avelus. Then the Mechaber is going to say later, if somebody died on Simchas Torah or somebody died on Achron Shel Pesach, and the Kvura happens then, you actually keep Avelus on that day. The last day counts as part of Shivah. The same halacha is true of the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Whether the mace was buried on the first day of Rosh Hashanah by Goyim, or he was buried on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And you don't keep the dinam of Avelos on that day, still the second day is going to count towards the Shivah. Now I'm going to read the Ramah over here, but I'm going to tell you right away up front that the Mishnah Berurah is going to say that this entire Ramah is a toyas, and actually we find that in the earlier prints of the Shulchan Aruch, this Ramah does not exist. Haggah says the Ramah Yom Sheni Rosh Hashanah Olam in Yeshiva Ein B'Yerodei Siman Shin Tzadik Tes if you give over Haggahis. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut and Tes Ein B'Yerodei Tos Seferu. This entire Ramah is a typo. Kiloin Niskar Shamet Midin Zeh. This marmokum that the Ramah gives, nothing is said pertaining to this topic over there at all. So this is a toyas atfus. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll pick up Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow with Ziv Gimel. The schus of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should send Yeshua's refuas and parnasa to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the bias called tzedek bebeher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.